I stared at the glowing screen, my hand frozen midair with a glass ornament still dangling from its hook. The Christmas tree behind me blinked half-finished, its garland hanging like a question mark. My husband says, "Don't come to Christmas dinner." My daughter hadn't even said it herself. She let him exile me with a borrowed voice. After decades of sacrifices, of holidays built with my hands, I was dismissed with a single text. Not a mother, not even a guest. Just unwanted. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe. The table looked almost festive, though only Eleanor was there to see it. She had laid out the pale blue tablecloth she reserved for special nights, smoothing it until there wasn't a wrinkle left. Plates waited at each place setting, 5 in total. She counted them again, as if the arithmetic of chairs might undo the reality of absence. 1 for herself, 1 for Joyce, and 3 left empty, waiting for her daughter, her son-in-law, and her grandson. The smell of simmering chicken soup filled the cottage, mingling with the faint sweetness of the cake she had baked early that morning. Pound cake, simple, unfussy. Eleanor had iced it with lemon glaze, thin but glossy. 6 candles waited on top, unlit, but positioned just so, because 60, 70, or 76 didn't matter. Candles mattered. They marked time. They marked love. Joyce was the first to arrive, carrying her own pound cake wrapped in foil and a package of floral paper plates tucked under her arm. "Double cake," she said brightly, kissing Eleanor's cheek. "If anyone complains, we tell them it's tradition." Her cheer filled the room, but her eyes swept the empty chairs. "They're late?" Eleanor pressed her lips together. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She checked the screen. A text from Greg. Something came up. Sorry, she waited, foolishly, for an explanation, a promise to make it up. Another buzz, this time from Rachel. Just 2 words. "I'm busy," no apology, no softened edges. A follow-up line came seconds later. "Next week?" The words burned hotter than the steam curling off the soup pot. Eleanor set the phone down with careful precision, as though too much force would shatter something. "They're not coming," she said finally. Joyce's jaw tightened, but she pulled out the paper plates and started stacking them. "Then we'll eat without them." The candles were lit anyway. The small flames wavered against the draft, sneaking in through the old windows. Joyce nudged the cake closer to Eleanor. "Blow them out for you," she said softly. Eleanor did, her breath steady but her chest heavy. The smoke curled upward, carrying the faint scent of burnt wick. She clapped politely once, because that's what people did when candles went out, even if the room felt hollow. Dinner was quiet but not empty. Joyce talked about a house she'd toured for a neighbor, about the stubborn creak of her own porch steps. They filled bowls, they cut cake. But the silence of 3 missing voices loomed over the table like shadows that had been invited but refused to come inside. When the dishes were cleared and Joyce kissed her goodbye, Eleanor returned to the phone. The screen still showed Rachel's last words. "I'm busy." She read them again, as if a second or third reading might reveal some hidden tenderness. There was none. She pressed delete. The message vanished into digital ash. The house grew still. Outside, cicadas buzzed in the humid Charleston air, their droning pulse seeping in through the open kitchen window. Eleanor moved slowly down the hall, her slippers brushing the wood floor, and entered the small office she had kept after retiring from the school. The desk smelled faintly of cedar polish, a scent she favored for keeping things neat, orderly. She opened the top drawer. Inside lay the folder she hadn't touched in years, the original will, yellowed at the edges, filled with tidy signatures and hopeful designations. She set it on the desk, pulling out a red pen from the porcelain holder. Her hand hovered over Rachel's name, inked clean and official. She thought of the empty chair at the table, the 2 words that had dismissed her birthday, her presence, her effort. "I'm busy." The pen touched paper. Slowly, deliberately, she drew a red line straight through her daughter's name, the stroke unbroken, permanent. The sound of ink on paper was faint but sharp, a whisper of finality. The candles were long extinguished. The frosting hardened along the edges of the pound cake. But Joyce lingered in Eleanor's kitchen, as if keeping watch. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed, her sharp eyes studying the older woman who moved with deliberate quiet. The plates had been washed and stacked, the chairs pushed back in order, but the air in the cottage still carried the faint ache of an abandoned celebration. Joyce finally broke the silence. "This isn't petty, Eleanor. It's preservation. You don't let people trample you until the grave and then reward them for it." Eleanor pressed her palms flat on the counter, her fingertips brushing a stray crumb. "It was just a birthday." "No," Joyce said firmly. "It was the line," and she stepped over it with both feet. The words settled between them, heavy and undeniable. Eleanor nodded once, but said nothing more. Joyce gave her arm a squeeze before gathering her things. "I'll call tomorrow, get some rest. You've got work to do." When the door closed and the cottage fell back into its quiet rhythm, Eleanor walked down the hall to her bedroom. The cake on the table still smelled faintly of lemon and sugar, but now it carried the stale undertone of something spoiled, not because it was old, but because it had been wasted. In the drawer of her nightstand, she found the shoebox she hadn't opened in years. Inside, letters tied with ribbon, cards with fading ink. She untied the ribbon carefully and sifted through until one particular envelope stopped her. The handwriting was familiar, younger, rounder. Rachel's, back in college. She unfolded the page. "Dear Mom, I miss you so much. I can't wait to come home for the summer. Thank you for everything you do. I don't say it enough." The words spilled with warmth, gratitude, love. A daughter who once knew how to see her mother. Eleanor placed the letter on her desk, then reached for the phone she had dropped earlier. She pulled up Rachel's last message. "I'm busy. Next week," and held the glowing screen beside the faded letter. The contrast was almost cruel. Past against present, love against dismissal. Her eyes stung, but she didn't cry. Instead, she laid the old letter next to the crumpled text printout she had made earlier and stared at them both. Evidence of change, evidence of loss. The desk lamp illuminated the edge of her filing cabinet. She hadn't opened it in years, except for taxes. She pulled the drawer open, the metal scraping sharply. Inside were folders, meticulously labeled. Insurance policies, property deeds, savings accounts, funeral arrangements. She leafed through each one slowly, her secretary's training making every detail matter. Her heart sank as she saw Rachel's name again and again. Default beneficiary on the life insurance, secondary contact on the utilities, executor in the funeral notes. Everywhere Eleanor turned, her daughter's name was threaded like a signature across her life. Eleanor pulled out a stack of sticky notes, the bright yellow sharp against the aged papers. She wrote 2 words on the first one: "Begin tomorrow." She stuck it on the top folder, the note standing like a flag planted in new territory. Then another sticky note, and another, marking each place where change was needed. The air grew thick around her, heavy with determination. She closed the drawer slowly, the files neat again, though now with bright yellow reminders stabbing out from the edges. She turned off the desk lamp, the house sinking into near darkness. The faint hum of cicadas filtered in through the window screen, steady as a heartbeat. Eleanor walked back toward the kitchen, her slippers brushing over the wooden floor. She poured herself a glass of water, the clink of ice against the glass sharp in the stillness. Then her phone buzzed on the counter. A new message lit the screen. She reached for it, half expecting Rachel again. But the name wasn't hers. It was Noah. "Grandma, did you have a birthday thing?" She sat at the kitchen table, the sticky notes still jutting from her file cabinet like yellow reminders of unfinished business. For a moment, she considered ignoring the message, protecting him from what his parents had chosen not to say. But Noah had always looked closer than the others, noticing when the flowers on her porch were freshly watered, when her shoes were worn down, when her voice carried a hesitation she didn't intend. Her fingers moved across the screen. It was just a quiet day, sweetheart. Nothing big. A few seconds later, Bubbles appeared. Then his reply, I'm sorry, I would have come. I didn't know. Eleanor felt her chest tighten, not from blame, but from the honesty in his apology. She typed back, It's not your fault. I had soup and good company. That's enough. She paused, then added, We'll have our own little celebration soon. The phone stayed quiet after that, but her heart remained unsettled. She stood, poured herself a fresh glass of water, and drifted toward the living room, where Joyce had returned with her usual stubborn insistence on helping clean what was already clean. He wrote, didn't he? Joyce asked, watching Eleanor's face. Yes, Eleanor admitted softly. She set the phone on the counter. He didn't know. Joyce gave a short, dry laugh. Of course he didn't. Rachel doesn't tell him anything that doesn't fit her schedule. Eleanor didn't argue. Instead, she ladled the last of the chicken soup into a smaller pot and set it back on the stove. The faint smell of garlic and thyme filled the air again, comforting but edged with something sharper, loneliness. When Noah came the next afternoon, he walked in with his backpack slung over one shoulder, hair falling into his eyes. He bent to hug her before even taking off his shoes. Happy birthday, Grandma, he said, voice almost sheepish. She kissed the top of his head. Thank you, darling. I really didn't know, he continued quickly. Mom just said you were busy, or didn't want anything big this year. If I'd known, She pressed a hand to his arm, steadying his rush of guilt. It was just a quiet day, nothing to worry over. But Noah shook his head. I would have come, I swear. They sat together at the kitchen table. Eleanor reheated the soup, ladled it into bowls, and placed a plate of buttered rolls between them. The steam curled upward, carrying with it the scent of rosemary she'd sprinkled in for depth. So, she said lightly, tell me about school. Noah grinned, tearing a roll in half. You don't want to hear about math tests, but my English teacher thinks I should try writing for the school paper. And band's going well. We're learning this old jazz piece. It's kind of fun. His voice animated the room. Eleanor listened closely, sipping soup, nodding at his stories. She let him speak about music, about friends, about the little details his parents rarely asked him. When he paused, his expression softened. Are you okay, Grandma? He asked quietly. Eleanor smiled, though it was lined with something deeper. She reached across the table and touched his hand. I'm thinking about the future, she said. Noah studied her, as though he wanted to press further, but he simply squeezed her fingers back and returned to his soup. From the kitchen doorway, Joyce leaned against the frame, her arms folded. She said nothing, just watched. The way Noah leaned in, the way Eleanor's face softened in his presence. She knew what Eleanor was preparing to do, even if the boy didn't. When Noah left, Eleanor stood at the window, watching him walk down the garden path, his shoulders squared beneath his backpack. The cottage grew quiet again, the faint sound of cicadas buzzing in the heavy Charleston air. She walked to the phone, picked it up, and dialed a number she had written on a sticky note the night before. After 2 rings, a calm voice answered. This is William Porter office. Eleanor's own voice was steady. I need to change some documents. Soon. The next morning, Eleanor stepped into the narrow hallway of an old building above a cafe. The scent of roasted coffee beans drifted upward, mixing with the faint musk of century-old wood. She knocked once before pushing open a frosted glass door marked Norma Williams, Attorney at Law, Estate and Legacy. Norma was already standing, a small woman with a calm posture and sharp eyes that missed nothing. A tray of tea waited on the corner of her desk, steam curling in thin wisps above porcelain cups. Come in, Mrs. Dawson, she said, gesturing toward the chair opposite her. I've set aside the morning. Eleanor sat carefully, smoothing her skirt. She glanced at the clipboard that rested between them, pages neatly clipped, pen poised. Norma didn't waste time with polite questions or empty condolences. She opened the file Eleanor had brought and said simply, Where shall we begin? Eleanor folded her hands on the desk. I don't want to leave behind paperwork she'll twist. Norma's lips curved slightly, though not into a smile. Then we'll untwist everything, down to the utilities if needed. For the next hour, they worked through every line of Eleanor's current documents. The will, the outdated trust, the life insurance forms, the property deed for the cottage, still carrying Dennis Dawson's name beside hers. Even though he had been gone nearly 15 years, every page was marked by Rachel's presence. Executor, beneficiary, second contact, default heir. Norma slid the documents across the desk one at a time. Her pen clicked steadily as she took notes, her handwriting precise, the strokes angled with purpose. You want a clean sweep, she said, not as a question, but as a statement. Yes, Eleanor's voice did not waver. Remove her from every line. Executor, proxy, beneficiary, gone. Who steps in her place? Eleanor didn't hesitate. Joyce, healthcare proxy, executor, trust overseer. She knows me better than anyone left alive, and she won't bend. Norma nodded as though she had expected that answer. She scribbled a note, the tip of her pen scratching softly against the paper. Then Joyce it is. We'll establish her as primary on every legal and medical file. I'll prepare new directives for the hospital, the bank, the county clerk. No ambiguity. The tea between them had gone lukewarm by the time Norma closed the file. She leaned back slightly, her gaze steady on Eleanor. This isn't about anger, she said. It's about protection, and once it's done, there will be no reversing it. That's what I want, Eleanor replied. She thought of the yellow sticky notes now marking every folder in her cabinet. Protection was the goal, not punishment. Yet a quiet satisfaction rippled through her chest as she imagined Rachel's name erased in ink, one document after another. Norma set her pen down and folded her hands. We'll need your signatures this week. Once notarized, your daughter will no longer exist in the eyes of your estate. She won't be able to step into the courthouse and claim what she thinks is hers. Eleanor exhaled slowly, the weight in her lungs easing. Then let's begin. They signed preliminary authorizations, Norma guiding her hand to each tabbed section. The faint smell of ink filled the air as her pen moved, each stroke cutting ties more effectively than any confrontation could. By noon, Eleanor left the office with a slim folder of drafts tucked into her purse, the papers light but powerful. She stepped back onto the street, where the smell of coffee mingled with salt carried in from the Charleston harbor. The pastel facades of nearby houses looked almost too bright, too cheerful, against the steady resolve building inside her. Back home, Joyce was waiting in the kitchen, a pot of coffee brewing. Eleanor laid the folder on the table. It started. Joyce poured 2 mugs, her tone flat but approving. Good. This is preservation, not pettiness. Don't forget that. Eleanor nodded. She didn't need reminding. The cottage was quiet again by late afternoon, sun filtering through the lace curtains. Eleanor settled at her desk, organizing her thoughts, when her laptop pinged. A new email slid into her inbox. The subject line froze her. Hey, Rachel said you're making changes. Everything okay? It was from Greg. Norma slid the final page across the desk, the air smelling faintly of fresh ink and lemon polish from the old wood. The folder that had once been swollen with Rachel's name was now thin, deliberate, stripped clean. Eleanor adjusted her glasses and read every line again, not because she doubted Norma, but because she wanted to savor the transformation. Irrevocable trust, Norma said, tapping the margin with her pen. Once you sign, there's no undoing. That's the point. No backdoor, no loophole. Eleanor's hand hovered over the paper, her pen poised. She remembered the red line she had drawn through Rachel's name days earlier, how final it had felt. This was louder than a red line. This was erasure in the language of law. She signed, her handwriting steady. Norma lifted the signed sheet gently, almost ceremonially, and slipped it into the binder. There it is. You just erase them, legally and cleanly. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Then let it stay erased. Rachel and Greg's names no longer sat anywhere in her estate. Their titles, executor, proxy, beneficiary, were stripped. Instead, a new structure bloomed in ink. At its center, Noah. The trust set aside funds for his education, a housing stipend, and a delayed inheritance that unlocked when he turned 25. Not a penny could be touched by his parents. Safeguards wound through the document like steel threads, contingencies that locked Rachel and Greg out of every corner. Attached at the back, Norma had added the letter Eleanor had dictated the night before. 4 lines, handwritten in her own careful script. Legacy is earned, not assumed. It wasn't a rebuke. It was truth, sharpened by absence. Norma leaned back in her chair. The life insurance has been rerouted. The savings and investments follow the same line. Title to the house transfers into the trust today. Everything passes directly to Noah, untouched by the others. It's sealed. Eleanor nodded, a calmness settling in her chest like steady water. For decades she had folded, compromised, waited for Rachel to see her again. She had been patient, perhaps too patient. But patience had finally turned into leverage. Joyce, who had insisted on accompanying her, tapped the desk with a fingernail. "This isn't revenge, it's preservation. Remember that." "I know," Eleanor said softly, though her eyes flicked to Norma. "Still, I won't deny it feels good to see her name vanish." Norma didn't smile, but her voice carried quiet certainty. "You've done more than strike a name. You've rewritten your legacy so it survives her neglect. That's the power of patience." The meeting ended with notarizations, Norma's stamp clicking down on page after page. The faint indentation of metal marked permanence. Eleanor left the office with a slim folder in her purse, lighter than it should have been for what it carried. Back in the cottage, she set the folder on the table and brewed tea. The house smelled of chamomile and the faint lemon glaze from the cake still wrapped in foil on the counter. She opened the folder again, not to review, but to remind herself. It was real, done, irreversible. Outside, the Charleston afternoon hummed with cicadas. Inside, the cottage was steady, quiet, hers. The phone rang. Eleanor reached for it, expecting Joyce checking in, or perhaps Noah. Instead, the caller ID showed Rachel. She let it ring twice before pressing accept. Rachel's voice came sharp, not apologetic. "So this is what I hear. You're making changes to the trust, to everything?" Eleanor stayed silent, letting her daughter's voice spill out in clipped bursts. "Are you punishing me for one missed party? Is that it? One birthday and suddenly I'm erased? That's what this is, isn't it?" Eleanor closed the folder slowly, the edges of the paper brushing against her palm. Her voice, when it came, was calm, almost gentle. "Rachel, it was never just one party." Eleanor glanced at the teacup cooling on the table beside her, steam curling in slow spirals. Her own voice came out steady, quiet enough that Rachel had to pause to hear it. "It wasn't one party. It was every party." On the other end, silence pulsed for a beat. Then Rachel exhaled hard, the sound sharp through the line. "I'm working, Mom. I've got deadlines, pressure, real pressure. You don't know what it's like to juggle a career and a family. You had it easier. You were a school secretary. That's not the same." Eleanor's eyes drifted to the photo frame on the mantel, Dennis holding baby Rachel at a picnic, sunlight cutting across their faces. Her lips pressed thin. "You're right, I was a secretary, and I still managed to show up for birthdays." Rachel scoffed, the sound brittle. "You're making this about ancient history. One lapse and you go nuclear? This is generational. You expect too much. Your standards are—" "Mine," Eleanor cut in, sharper now. "My standards, my life, my estate." The silence stretched again, heavier this time. On Rachel's end, Eleanor could hear the faint scrape of a chair, the murmur of Greg's voice somewhere in the background. Finally, Rachel said, "This is cruel. You're punishing me for being busy, for having a life. Eleanor straightened the folder of papers on her lap, aligning the corners. Rachel, she said softly, almost tenderly, thank you for the call. Then she pressed the button and ended it. The dial tone filled the room, brief and final. Eleanor set the phone down beside her tea. Her heart was steady, her breath even. Joyce, who had been standing in the doorway the entire time, arms folded, shook her head. That wasn't closure, that was documentation. Eleanor looked up. Documentation? Joyce's mouth curved, but it wasn't a smile. She just proved your point out loud, on record, every excuse lined up in a row. Work, stress, expectations, anything but responsibility. She gave you a transcript of why you were right. Eleanor let out a soft laugh. More exhale than amusement. So it's not closure, but evidence. Exactly. Joyce crossed to the window, peering out at the camellia bushes lining the walk. And you'd better believe she'll try to rope Greg into this mess. The prediction proved true within hours. Eleanor's phone buzzed again, this time a text from Greg. Hey, Rachel's upset. Maybe we should sit down together, talk this through? Eleanor read it once, then set the phone face down without replying. She imagined Greg standing in the kitchen beside Rachel, trying to soothe her with vague promises. Unwilling to say no, unwilling to say yes. His neutrality had always been his shield. Meanwhile, Norma worked quickly. By the end of the week, the trust documents were stamped, scanned, and filed at the county office. Eleanor received a certified copy in the mail, thick with official seals. She ran her fingers across the embossed paper, the ridges firm beneath her skin. Every stroke of ink was now backed by the weight of law. This, Norma had said during their last meeting, is the lock on the door. She can rattle it all she wants, but it won't open. That night, Eleanor returned to her office to tuck the new documents into her safe. As she slid them into place, her hand brushed against a thicker envelope shoved behind a stack of old tax returns. Curious, she pulled it free. It was a printed copy of her old will, dated over a decade ago. The paper was creased, margins smudged. At first she thought it was simply worn from handling. Then she saw the handwriting, not hers, Rachel's. Blue ink bled into the edges where her daughter had scribbled notes. Increase this amount. Revisit property clause. Check with attorney about changing terms. Eleanor froze, the envelope trembling slightly in her hands. Her daughter hadn't just dismissed birthdays. She had treated her mother's legacy like a draft, waiting for edits. Eleanor sat at her desk, the old will spread across the surface like a wound she hadn't meant to reopen. Rachel's handwriting bled along the margins in restless loops. Increase this amount. Revisit this clause. Property clause. Ask attorney about changes. Every note carried the same assumption, that her mother's legacy was hers to mold. Eleanor traced one line with her finger, the ink smudged at the edge. Her daughter hadn't written these with hesitation. She had written them with entitlement, as though editing her mother's choices was no different than revising a memo. Joyce entered quietly, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She set one down and leaned over Eleanor's shoulder. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the notes. Well, isn't that something? Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. She saw my life as a draft. Joyce straightened, arms crossed, her voice sharp. She expected control, not consequences. She assumed you'd never question her edits. Eleanor folded the old will carefully, but her hands trembled just enough to betray her anger. She stood, crossed to the fireplace, and knelt. The air smelled faintly of cedar ash from the night before. She struck a match, the sulfur sharp in her nose, and touched it to the edge of the paper. The flames licked quickly, orange swallowing ink, black curling at the margins. Rachel's handwriting vanished first, the loops and arrows collapsing into ash. Eleanor watched until the paper was gone, until the fire crackled with nothing but remnants. When the flames settled, she stood and walked back to the safe tucked in the corner. From her purse, she pulled out the new trust and will Norma had prepared. The paper felt heavier than it looked. its authority sealed in every embossed page. She slid it into the safe, locked the dial, and felt the weight shift from her shoulders to the steel door. Her phone sat on the desk. Eleanor picked it up, dialed her bank, and waded through the tinny hold music. When the representative answered, she spoke clearly. "I need to revoke a power of attorney, effective immediately." Her voice didn't shake. She named Rachel, then paused before adding, "Replace her with Norma Williams, my attorney. Her firm will serve as the point of contact on all accounts." The representative confirmed, her tone polite but final. Eleanor ended the call, exhaling into the stillness of the room. She repeated the process with her insurance company, her pension line, each number scratched neatly on a notepad beside her. One by one, Rachel's name disappeared from the files. By the time she hung up the last call, the afternoon sun had tilted through the curtains, painting the floor in stripes of gold. Eleanor sat back in her chair, the air smelling faintly of burnt paper and brewed coffee. She felt lighter, not triumphant, not vindictive, but resolved. Joyce returned, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Well, it's done," Eleanor said. "Her name is gone." Joyce studied her face, then gave a single approving nod. "Good. That's one more door locked." Eleanor managed a small smile. "And the right one's open." The cottage settled into evening quiet, the ticking clock loud against the silence. Eleanor moved to the window, watching the street where the magnolia leaves swayed in the breeze. She thought she might finally have an hour's peace. Then came the knock. It wasn't loud, just a polite, awkward tap against the front door. Eleanor hesitated before opening it. Greg stood on the porch, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, his posture uneasy. He glanced past her shoulder as though expecting Rachel to appear inside. "Hi," he said, his voice strained. "Can I come in for a minute?" Eleanor's gaze stayed steady. "What is it, Greg?" He shifted, cleared his throat. "Did Rachel do something?" Greg stood awkwardly in Eleanor's entryway, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. The air smelled faintly of cedar ash from the fireplace, where her daughter's edits had burned the night before. He kept glancing past her shoulder into the living room, as though expecting to see Rachel pacing inside. Eleanor crossed her arms. "What is it you want, Greg?" He cleared his throat. Rachel's upset. She said you're making changes. Big ones." Her face stayed calm, her eyes steady. "I am." Greg nodded slowly, buying himself time. He rubbed the back of his neck. A nervous habit she remembered from years of family dinners. "She thinks maybe you're overreacting, that this is all, I don't know, because of one missed party." "One missed party?" Eleanor's voice cut sharper than she intended, but she didn't soften it. "Is that what she told you?" He shifted again, guilt flickering across his features. "I know there's more to it. I'm not saying she's perfect. I try not to get in the middle. You don't have to fix her, Greg." Eleanor stepped closer, her tone low but unwavering. "I never expected you to fix her, just not to amplify her." Greg blinked, caught off guard. "Amplify." You echo her excuses. You soften her edges when she should feel them. And in doing so, you let her believe silence is the same as absolution. The clock ticked loudly from the mantel. Greg's eyes dropped, his voice barely audible. "She's under pressure. You know how her job is." Eleanor let out a humorless laugh. "So was I. I still baked the cake." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Greg didn't argue. He glanced once more around the cottage, the tidy kitchen, the safe tucked discreetly near the corner, the framed photo of Dennis still watching from the mantel. He looked like a man who wanted to say more but lacked the courage to speak it aloud. "I should go," he murmured. Eleanor opened the door wider. "Yes, you should." He stepped out into the cool evening air, the scent of salt from the nearby harbor drifting faintly on the breeze. His footsteps crunched on the gravel walkway, fading into the distance without another word. Joyce emerged from the kitchen where she had been listening, arms folded tight across her chest. "He's not blind, you know," she said. "He sees it. He just doesn't have the spine to name it. Eleanor lowered herself into a chair, her hands resting in her lap. Silence is still complicity. Joyce gave a short nod. They thought they had time. They didn't check the hourglass. The room grew quiet, save for the distant hum of cicadas outside the open window. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, steadying her breath. She had expected resistance, even anger. What she hadn't expected was Greg's soft neutrality, his willingness to nod along with Rachel's narrative while never daring to challenge her. It was weakness, not cruelty, but weakness could do just as much damage. Later that night, Eleanor brewed chamomile tea, the steam curling against her face, and set it beside her on the small desk. She logged onto her computer to check the local probate site, scanning the digital records to confirm Norma's filings were complete. The trust sat there, locked in the county system. Permanent. Satisfied, she closed the browser and opened her email. Nothing new. But when she shifted over to the newsfeed, her chest tightened. Rachel's name appeared on a social media post, public, careless, and barbed. The words stared back at her in black and white, tired of being guilt-tripped by older generations. The words were still on the screen when Eleanor set her mug down and reached for her glasses. Tired of being guilt-tripped by older generations. Public, bold, and timed for maximum sympathy. The glow of the laptop threw a cold light across the kitchen tile, making the room look sharper, almost sterile. Outside, a breeze carried briny air in from the harbor. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lemon oil and the last of last night's tea. She forwarded the link to Norma with no comment. She didn't need to explain the subtext. The attorney would read it, the way she read everything, line by line, motive by motive. Norma called within minutes, calm and focused. I've already captured screenshots and metadata, timestamps, visibility, engagement. It's character context, evidence of narrative building, not truth. Papers rustled softly on Norma's end, methodical, confident. We'll anchor it to your file. Eleanor exhaled. Good. And we're going to widen your digital protections, Norma continued. If she's taking this public, we close every remaining window. They met that afternoon in the office above the cafe. The stairwell smelled of espresso and old wood. Downstairs, cups chimed against saucers like a muted bell. Norma had a tablet open and a printed packet waiting, tabs color-coded with surgical neatness. Digital Legacy Directive, Norma said, sliding a page forward. This governs your online estate, obituary language, death notifications, memorial service mentions. We'll specify no references to Rachel or Greg. No standing, no management rights, no access to social accounts or memorial pages. It gives the funeral home and the paper a single source of truth. Eleanor scanned the language. Each line was spare, exact. No mentions, she said, steady. Norma marked the clause. And the funeral directive already lists Joyce as sole coordinator. I'll notify the funeral home in advance, quietly. They'll have a certified copy on file. The pen in Eleanor's hand felt heavier than ink should allow. She initialed each margin, signed her name where the tabs told her to. The scratch of pen on paper was almost soothing, a quiet sound of doors clicking shut. Next, Norma said, tapping a new tab. We add a no contest clause to the will and cross-reference it in the trust. If Rachel or Greg challenge any part, they trigger forfeiture of any minor items or discretionary gifts they might have otherwise claimed. Photos, keepsakes, anything not listed that we might have allowed through. It deters nuisance lawsuits. Eleanor caught the phrase, forfeiture penalty. It's steel edge unmistakable. Add it. Norma wrote in a neat slanted hand, then read the new language aloud. Any person who directly or indirectly challenges this estate or attempts to interfere with a fiduciary's duties forfeits any nominal distributions or non-monetary allowances. She looked up. That's the gate. They try to storm it, they lose the right to ask for even a photograph. Eleanor nodded once, The decision sat cleanly inside her. Norma assembled copies with crisp efficiency. One sealed envelope for the funeral home, one courier packet for the county clerk to append to the file, one for Eleanor's safe. The room filled with the scent of warm toner and paper dust. A printer humming softly like a distant hive. When Eleanor returned home, Joyce was already at the kitchen table, a stack of floral note cards beside a cooling kettle. She took the envelopes, weighing them in her palm the way realtors weigh keys. That post was her signature, Joyce said, dry as sand. She didn't even know it. She wanted an audience, Eleanor replied, sliding one envelope into the safe. The metal door swallowed it with a clean, hollow sound. Now she's got one, Joyce said, tapping the second envelope. The funeral home copy. But it's a clerk with a stamp. Near dusk, Eleanor's phone buzzed. Greg again. Could we talk this through? I think everyone's heated. Maybe a conversation in person would help. She read the message twice and set the phone face down on the table. The cottage clock ticked. Outside, a gull cut across the fading light, a single angle against a pale sky. She brewed fresh tea and opened her email instead. Norma had sent a summary memo. Digital Legacy Directive executed. Funeral coordination locked to Joyce Preston. No contest clause with forfeiture penalty attached to will and cross-referenced in trust. Funeral home acknowledges receipt and will follow written directives exclusively. Below it, a scanned page showed the funeral director's signature. Block letters neat and final. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment and listened. The kettle settling, the faint rustle of the oak by the side fence, the soft ping of the cooling oven. The house felt quieter, but not empty, quiet like a ledger balanced at last. Her laptop chimed once more. A new message populated at the top of her inbox with the county seal in the header. She clicked, filed and certified. The subject line was spare, the body briefer. Your amended documents have been received and entered into the public record. Certification attached. The cottage was quiet except for the scratch of Eleanor's pen. She sat at her desk with the lamp angled low, the glow catching on the fresh sheet of paper. Around her, the air smelled faintly of chamomile and wood polish, a mix of comfort and resolve. She had written letters her whole life, birthday notes tucked into Rachel's lunchbox, cards mailed to dorm rooms, reminders taped to refrigerators, letters that were skimmed, shrugged at, sometimes left unopened. But this one would not be ignored. She began plainly, to whom it may concern. Norma had told her it should read like evidence, not like poetry. Still, Eleanor's words carried a rhythm, each sentence clipped but deliberate. This isn't revenge, it is response. She paused, then drew a line beneath it, anchoring the thought. The letter continued with fragments of memory, not the warm ones, but the small cuts that had built into scars. She quoted Rachel directly. I'm busy. Next week? Sorry, I forgot. It slipped my mind. Work ran over again. Maybe tomorrow. Phrases plucked from decades of texts, voicemails, missed calls. One line read, on my 60th birthday, she sent flowers, but no visit. On my 70th, she promised dinner, but canceled. On my 76th, she sent 2 words. I'm busy. The words did not waver into sentiment. They documented. They measured absence with precision. When she finished, Eleanor set down the pen and read the letter twice, the silence pressing in around her. Her handwriting was steady, her meaning undeniable. It wasn't a plea for pity. It was a ledger balanced, a record of choice and consequence. Joyce appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed loosely. Writing it down? Yes. Eleanor folded the pages neatly. If she wouldn't listen while I was speaking, she can't avoid reading it when it's filed. Joyce stepped inside, brushed her hand over the desk. That's not a letter, it's a mirror. She won't like what she sees. Eleanor sealed the pages in a cream envelope. The next morning she carried it to Norma's office, her steps measured, the Charleston air heavy with salt and magnolia. Norma skimmed the first page, her expression unreadable but respectful. Plain, honest, final, she murmured, stamping her notary seal with a firm press. The metallic impression caught the light. This attaches directly to the trust and the will. If she tries to contest, the court will see her record reflected back in your own words. Good, Eleanor said, her voice low. Then it will stand longer than I can. Norma made 3 copies. One slid into the thick trust binder, another into a sealed court file, the last into an envelope Eleanor carried home. That evening, the cottage smelled of lemon pound cake. Joyce had baked, insisting sugar helped steel the nerves. Eleanor slid the extra copy across the kitchen table toward her. For backup, Eleanor said. Joyce tapped the envelope once, nodding. Understood. She tucked it into her purse without another word, but her eyes shone with something harder than friendship. Loyalty, anchored in paper and fire. The night deepened, cicadas buzzing beyond the screened window. Eleanor felt the shift inside her chest. Not relief, not triumph, but a quiet certainty. She had written a record her daughter could not wave away with excuses. The phone buzzed against the counter. Eleanor ignored it at first, pouring tea into a porcelain cup, the steam fogging her glasses. But when she glanced at the screen, the message glowed in harsh clarity, not from Rachel, from Noah. The preview line was short, hesitant. Mom says she thinks you're cutting us off. Is that true? Eleanor set the cup down carefully, the porcelain clinking against the saucer. The words on the screen blurred for a moment, not from weakness, but from the weight of what they meant. Rachel had finally pulled Noah into the game. Eleanor sat at Norma's desk again. The window cracked open to let in the salt, thick Charleston air. Below, the cafe clattered with the sound of cups and chairs, the faint hiss of steaming milk rising like a heartbeat. Inside the office, everything was quiet except for the steady shuffle of papers sliding across polished wood. This section, Norma said, tapping the binder, is exclusively for Noah. Structured trust, no parental oversight, no joint control. Your daughter and son-in-law won't see a dime, not even a whiff. Eleanor adjusted her glasses, eyes following each line. When does it release? At 25. Earlier than that, only college tuition, a modest housing stipend, and basic living costs. Paid directly to him or to institutions, never through Rachel or Greg. The language was precise, airtight. Eleanor ran her fingers along the page, as if feeling the lock that would keep her grandson safe. And the letters, she asked. Norma nodded, sliding a slim folder forward. Filed separately, sealed until distribution at the designated age. I'll make sure they're attached and preserved. Eleanor opened the folder. Inside were cream envelopes, each addressed in her own hand. Noah, 18. Noah, 21. Noah, 25. She touched the paper gently, as though it were skin. Each letter was short, each one carrying more than money, advice, memory, reminders that he had been seen. On the last one, she had written a single line in careful script. You were the only one who looked up. Norma watched her fold the pages again. Her voice softened. He may never know what you did. That's the point. He'll only know that something steady was waiting for him, long after the noise is gone. Eleanor set the folder back in place. Maybe not, but he'll feel it. The notary arrived, stamping each page with a sharp press. The smell of warm ink filled the air, blending with the faint lemon cleaner Norma's assistant had wiped across the desk. Each stamp was final, unyielding. Eleanor signed her name beneath, her pen gliding with certainty. By the time she left the office, the day had tipped into late afternoon. The streets were warm, pastel houses glowing in the fading sun. Eleanor paused outside the cafe, listening to the laughter spilling through the door, then walked slowly back toward her cottage. At home, Joyce was waiting with a vase of fresh roses clipped from her own garden. She arranged them in the kitchen as Eleanor slid the new documents into her safe, the lock clicking shut. Well, Joyce asked. It's done, Eleanor said. She poured 2 glasses of iced tea, the clink of ice punctuating her words. Everything he needs is there. Everything they can't touch. Joyce leaned against the counter, her eyes softening. He'll never doubt where he stood with you. Eleanor allowed herself a rare smile. That's all I want. The evening crept in gently, cicadas buzzing just beyond the porch, the smell of roses mingling with the faint salt air drifting through the screen door. Eleanor sat at her desk, pen in hand, scribbling another note for Noah, not meant for legal files, but for the inside of his backpack the next time he visited. Her phone lit up on the counter. She ignored it at first, finishing her line. But the buzz came again, sharper, insistent. She reached for it and froze at the name on the screen. Rachel. This time there was no clipped text, no pretense of soft edges. The phone vibrated hard in her hand until she pressed accept. Her daughter's voice burst through the line, sharp as glass. Unbelievable, Mom. You're cutting me out of everything? After all these years, after everything I've done for you, this is how you treat your only daughter. Do you know how selfish you sound? You think Joyce and some lawyer care about you more than your own blood? You're making a fool of yourself. Everyone's laughing at this little performance. And Noah, don't you dare drag him into this. He's my son, not yours. If you think you can manipulate him with money, you're pathetic. Do you hear me? Pathetic. The voicemail clicked off abruptly, leaving a hollow silence. Eleanor stood still for a long moment, the phone heavy in her hand, her tea cooling on the table. The bitterness in Rachel's voice wasn't new. It was the self-pity that lingered like smoke, choking the edges of every word. She replayed the message once, not out of doubt, but to hear the tone again, the bite, the entitlement. The way Rachel's voice wavered when she mentioned Noah. Beneath the anger was fear, and fear had a sound Eleanor recognized. She saved the voicemail, forwarded it directly to Norma with a subject line that read only for the file. Norma responded within the hour. Received. Added to evidence folder. Tone, content, and intent all noted. It reinforces the record of estrangement and supports enforceability of directives. Keep all further messages, but do not respond. Eleanor deleted the original from her phone, but kept the confirmation. The record existed now, locked in a file that Rachel couldn't erase, not even if she tried. Joyce arrived later that afternoon with groceries, the scent of fresh basil and tomatoes trailing into the cottage as she unpacked the bag onto the counter. Eleanor poured her a glass of iced tea. The clink of cubes sharp in the quiet. Joyce spotted the look on her face immediately. What happened? Voicemail, Eleanor said simply. Joyce set down a loaf of bread, her eyes narrowing. Let me guess, anger, excuses, and not a hint of apology. Eleanor pressed her lips together. She said I was pathetic, that I was trying to buy Noah. Joyce snorted, slicing the bread with unnecessary force. That wasn't strategy, that was panic. She looked up, her voice softer, but no less sharp. That was the sound of someone realizing they lost. Eleanor let the words settle. There was truth in them. Rachel had left a record of her own undoing, and she hadn't even realized it. That evening, Eleanor pulled out her mixing bowls and set them on the counter. She sifted flour, cracked eggs, added butter and sugar. The familiar rhythm steadied her, measuring, folding, pouring batter into a small tin. The smell of vanilla filled the kitchen, rising with the hum of the oven fan. When the cake cooled, she cut one slice, placed it on her best china, and carried it to the table. She ate slowly, fork tapping softly against porcelain, each bite sweet but firm. It wasn't a celebration. It wasn't mourning. It was proof that she didn't need an audience or permission to mark her days. The house was quiet again by the time she washed the plate and set it back in the cupboard. The roses Joyce had left earlier were beginning to open, filling the room with their faint perfume. Eleanor leaned against the counter, satisfied with the stillness. Then she noticed the letter propped in the stack of mail by the door. A white envelope, the hospital's logo crisp in the corner. Routine checkup results. She turned it over in her hands, the paper smooth but suddenly heavy, as if holding something unspoken inside. Her fingers hovered on the seal. She had expected nothing unusual, just numbers on a page. But the weight of the envelope made her pause. The rain had stopped. Outside, the sky was washed clean. Inside, Eleanor slid the letter onto the table, its edges catching the light. Something about it didn't feel routine at all. The paper trembled faintly in her hands, not from weakness but from the weight of what it said. Early-stage pancreatic cancer. Treatment options available, prognosis, uncertain. The words were clinical, stripped of comfort, yet they rang louder than any accusation Rachel had ever hurled. She laid the paper flat on the table, smoothing the edges as though order could tame it. Outside, Charleston's evening air carried the briny scent of the harbor, blending with the faint sweetness of the roses Joyce had left in a vase. A gull cried overhead, sharp and distant, like punctuation at the end of a sentence she hadn't meant to write. For several minutes, she didn't move. The clock on the mantel ticked, steady and unbothered, as if mocking her realization that her own time might not be so steady at all. Finally, she reached for her phone. One call. Norma answered on the second ring, her voice crisp but warm. "Eleanor?" "I need to accelerate everything," Eleanor said. Her voice carried no tremor, only resolve. "Every directive, every file. I won't leave anything unfinished." There was a pause, the sound of the papers shifting in the background. "I'll come by tomorrow. We'll move faster." The next morning, Norma arrived at the cottage with a stack of binders. She spread them across the dining table, the smell of ink and paper filling the room. "We'll confirm legal and medical alignment, durable healthcare proxy, final directives, accelerated asset transfers where permissible." Her tone was calm, clinical, but her eyes were not. They softened whenever they caught Eleanor's. Eleanor signed page after page, her pen steady. Each signature was another line of defense against the chaos Rachel might try to unleash if she ever found out. "Backups?" Eleanor asked. Norma nodded. "One copy here, one in my office, one in the county vault. I'll courier the rest. And Joyce will have hers tonight," Eleanor finished. By evening, Eleanor and Joyce sat in the warm glow of the cottage, 2 glasses of wine between them. The documents, sealed in envelopes, rested on the counter like soldiers lined in quiet readiness. Joyce tapped her glass gently. "You've built a fortress. She'll never breach it." Eleanor stared into her drink, the reflection of the lamplight trembling on the surface. "Fortresses crumble eventually. I just need mine to hold long enough." They drank in silence for a moment, the hum of cicadas outside filling the space between them. Eleanor felt the weight of her diagnosis pressing against her ribs, not as fear but as urgency. She had no time to waste, not on arguments, not on regrets, and certainly not on Rachel's bitterness. The following days blurred into movement. Eleanor updated her medical directives at the clinic, her pulse calm as she signed papers in front of a notary who smelled faintly of lavender hand lotion. She sent sealed packets to Norma's office and delivered another to the clerk at the century-old probate building, its wooden floors creaking beneath her shoes, as though echoing each decision. At home, she wrote more letters, short ones to Noah, folded neatly and slid into envelopes. She placed them in the small cedar box that had once belonged to her mother, the wood still carrying a faint, aged scent. Each note was simple, a reminder, a fragment of memory. You were seen, you mattered. You were the only one who looked up. Rachel knew nothing of any of this. Eleanor imagined her daughter scrolling through her phone, making sharp posts online, never realizing that the ground beneath her inheritance had already been pulled away. One evening, Eleanor lit a candle in the living room, the faint smell of beeswax curling into the air. She sat in the armchair with her hands folded, Dennis's photo watching from the mantel. "It's nearly finished," she whispered, more to herself than to the memory of him. The knock at the door startled her. Firm, urgent, but not harsh. She set down her glass of water and rose slowly, her joints stiff from the long day. The cottage was quiet, save for the faint rustle of wind through the screen porch. She opened the door. Noah stood there alone, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his face serious in a way she had never seen before. "Grandma," he said softly, his voice almost breaking. "I needed to come." Noah stepped into the cottage, the faint smell of cinnamon and roses wrapping around him like a quilt. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he set his backpack down and moved toward Eleanor with a deliberate steadiness, his arms opening before she could even lift hers. The hug was firm, unhurried, the kind that seemed to say what words couldn't. Eleanor felt his shoulders tense and relax all at once, like he'd been carrying something heavy that finally slipped away. When he let go, he handed her a card. Hand-drawn, folded carefully. "I didn't get to give this to you," he said, his voice low. She opened it slowly. The paper smelled faintly of pencil and glue, the kind of imperfect creation that carried more weight than any store-bought card. Inside, block letters spelled, "Happy birthday, Grandma. Thanks for always noticing me." Her throat tightened, but she smiled. "It's perfect." They moved to the kitchen, where the kettle whistled faintly, and she poured them both tea. The steam fogged the edges of her glasses, softening Noah's face across the table. They didn't speak of Rachel or Greg or anything heavy. Instead, their words meandered. School projects, his favorite new band, the soup he'd tried to cook that had turned out far too salty. Eleanor laughed, the sound lighter than she'd expected from herself. The clock ticked in the background, but neither hurried. Their conversation spilled across small things, but every small thing carried meaning. Noah listened, not nodding absently, but fully listening, his eyes attentive, his hands folded like he was memorizing the moment. When the tea cooled, they stepped outside. The Charleston evening air was damp and warm, carrying the scent of the marsh and the faint sweetness of blooming jasmine. Eleanor fetched her clippers and a basket, and together they moved along the garden rows. Noah clipped carefully under her guidance, the roses falling softly into the basket, their fragrance filling the night air. "You were always watching," she said, her voice carrying into the stillness between them, even when they weren't. Noah looked up from the rose in his hand. His eyes widened slightly, a question forming but never spoken. Instead, he gave a quiet nod, holding her gaze with a seriousness that startled her. By the time they returned inside, the basket was full. Eleanor wrapped a few stems for him to take, tying them with twine. Then she packed a small bag of cookies she had baked the night before, slipping the card he'd given her back into the envelope and tucking it between the cookies as though it belonged there. When Noah slung his backpack over his shoulder again, the weight seemed lighter. He hugged her a second time at the door, holding on a fraction longer. "I'll come back soon," he said. "I'll be here," Eleanor replied, her voice even. She didn't tell him how much those words mattered, or how uncertain soon really was. She watched him walk down the gravel path, the crunch of his sneakers fading into the quiet hum of cicadas. His figure grew smaller against the pastel row houses until he turned the corner and disappeared. The house settled back into stillness. Eleanor closed the door gently, leaning for a moment against the wood. The roses they'd cut filled the kitchen with fragrance, their petals already beginning to soften in the vase. She moved to her desk, the lamplight glowing across the wood, and pulled open the drawer. From the stack of envelopes, she drew one more, her handwriting neat and deliberate across its face. Inside was a final note, short, measured, designed not for the courts or the records, but for the boy who had shown up when no one else did. Her hands didn't shake as she slid the envelope into the cedar box inside the safe. The metal door closed with a firm, echoing click. The last envelope was in place. The cottage was quiet, the kind of quiet Eleanor had learned to love. Papers sat stacked neatly on the desk, the cedar box resting inside the safe, its lock turned one last time. Only one letter remained in her hand, a note for Noah folded into thirds, her handwriting steady across the page. "Happy future. That was all it said. 2 words, but they carried the weight of every choice she had made. She slid the note into an envelope, sealed it, and placed it atop the pile of finished documents. The afternoon light fell warm through the lace curtains, scattering patterns across the hardwood. Wind stirred outside, rattling the chimes on the porch. They sang a low, hollow tune, a reminder of the years that had blown past her, fast, sharp, unstoppable. Norma arrived for the final review, her presence brisk but careful. She laid the thick trust binder on the table, the leather cover gleaming. Everything sealed, witnessed, notarized. Copies in the court vault, my office, and Joyce's possession. Nothing left undone. Eleanor adjusted her glasses and scanned the tabs one last time. Each section carried a piece of her, assets rerouted, powers revoked, names erased. And if she tries? Norma shook her head. The no contest clause makes it a closed door. Legally, she has no footing. Rachel could shout from the rooftops, but it would echo into nothing. The words settled in Eleanor's chest like a final exhale. Good. When Norma left, Eleanor prepared a second envelope, this one addressed to Joyce, her best friend who had carried every secret without hesitation. She wrote in clean script, "If she comes crying, give her the binder. Let her read every date. It wasn't cruel, it was precise. Rachel would see each missed call, each empty chair, each line of ink that closed the door she had left open too many times." Eleanor slipped the letter into the outgoing tray near the door, where Joyce would find it tomorrow. The house grew dim as evening came. She lit a lamp, then turned to the kitchen. The scent of vanilla filled the air as she pulled a pound cake from its tin, one she had baked that morning with measured hands. The crust was golden, the inside still soft. She cut a single slice, placed it on her good china, and carried it to the table. She ate slowly, savoring each bite. Alone, on purpose. It wasn't sadness that accompanied her. It was clarity. For once, she didn't imagine Rachel arriving late or making excuses. She didn't picture a family gathering that never came to be. The chair across from her was empty, and it was supposed to be. When she finished, she rinsed the plate and returned it to the cupboard. The kitchen smelled of sugar and warmth, lingering like a memory. In the living room, Dennis's photograph caught the lamplight. He was smiling in that steady way of his, a quiet reassurance from a time when things were simpler. Eleanor stepped closer, brushing her hand along the edge of the frame. "It's done," she whispered. The wind outside picked up, and the chimes sang again. Higher this time, like a voice carried across water. She sat in her armchair, folding her hands in her lap, listening. The room was full of roses, of paper, of quiet victories, full of her choices, her protections, her refusals to be erased. For a long time, she sat there in the glow of the lamp, the hum of the world settling around her, every directive signed, every envelope sealed, every silence accounted for. When the clock struck 9, she leaned back, the faintest smile softening her face. She wasn't waiting for a call or a visit or an apology, not anymore. Her story had been written, notarized, and filed. And in the final line of that story, she let the truth stand bare. "My daughter skipped my birthday party and texted, 'I'm busy,' so I erased her name from every paper that mattered.